Hi, we continue in Luke 10 today in Jesus telling the story of three people who encounter a half-dead, stripped man beaten and lying on the road from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And as we continue in this passage, as you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been exploring some of the many characters and characteristics of people in this passage. Because although the story seems at one level to have an easy and obvious um, lesson from it, to be kind to strangers on the road, hence it's part of a law to protect people, there's a lot more going on. In the last video, we looked at previous 2 videos ago, we looked at the disciples and the lawyer, the Namakos. Last video, we looked at the various issues around neighbor and how plesion is one of 3 Greek words translated as neighbor and what that might mean. And then we also looked at the naked half-dead man and the Lestes, the robbers or bandits that we saw were part of almost certainly an organized group designed to extract wealth from the wealthy and to give it to themselves or to others around them. Today, we're going to encounter a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan on the road. And as we do, it'll be very important to understand who each of those are in ways that are very different than what scholars have thought recently. When I was first a young scholar working on these things, my first effort was on the Gospel of John. And you may well know that the Gospel of John has Jesus go to Samaria and encounter a woman of Samaria at the well. And when I was working on that, I dealt with the scholarship at the time, which is from the 80s and the early 90s. My book was published in 1994, and I finished writing it in 1992. And I remember at the time I was graced to get a blurb on the book from the great activist and scholar James Douglas, who mentored me in discipleship out of the Bangor submarine base here in Western Washington. And although not a biblical scholar, he was always very insightful about Jesus and the contexts of Jesus' work. And in their own newspaper, the newspaper of Ground Zero, he once had an article called "The Good Communist," paralleling the Good Samaritan here. So he asked me at one point, just casually, and I thought I saw a knowing look in his eye, like he already knew what he thought was the answer. Who did I think the Samaritans were? And all I could say at the time was that they were like the former Israelites, and he smiled and just left it there, and my sense was he knew something more that he wasn't telling me. But that was in the 90s. And now, fortunately, thanks to the work of Matthew Chalmers, we have this recent review of work since 2004, published here in 2021, which has really blown up my understanding and many other scholars' understanding of who the Samaritans were. And he also wrote an article on it the year before in 2020, Rethinking Luke 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan Israelite. So we're going to get to that, but first we have to get to priests and Levites before we see how the Samaritans may be very different than who we might imagine they are. So as we begin, we're still looking at the 2 halves of this story and their parallels. The part we're looking at today is not parallel here directly. If we want to see that it's totally parallel, we could say it's parallel to what is written in the law, but it's not directly about the law. It'll be the green part we'll look at next time when the Samaritan tends to the wounded man that is parallel to the question of loving your neighbor as yourself. Last time when we started in verse 30, we began to look at the number of rare words that are in this story, and we saw these 3 last time, and now we're going to see a couple more here, and we see how many of those there are, because this is a uniquely Lucan story. But other stories are also uniquely Lucan, like the prodigal son story in chapter 15, and it doesn't have nearly as many unique or rare words as this. So it's something to be paying attention to, because words that are rare like that, the meaning has to be discerned from something other than their usage in other contexts. And so we already looked at this character and characterization, and the first thing that we're seeing as the story begins here after the person is left on the road, by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Several things to look at here before we look at the question of priest. The word for chance, as I just showed in my rare words list, is only here in the Bible. And as Marshall notes down below, Jericho was one of the principal country residences for priests, which would make sense that if they're doing their work in Jerusalem, Jericho is the city down at the end of the road, so they would go down there and they could go back up. Although it's not exactly around the corner, as I showed last time on Google Maps, it's about 38 kilometers from Jericho up to the Jerusalem temple. So it wasn't something you would do casually, but off-season, when it wasn't their turn, they could be down there. And they're going down the road, which is highlighting that, like the man who was beaten upon. They had already done their service or been present at rituals and ceremonies in the Jerusalem temple, and now were either going home or heading somewhere else down the road to Jericho. Um, and one of the aspects of this that we have to look at is that older characterizations, as Chalmers is, and so many others that I noted in the introductory video about recent scholarship, not just on Samaritans, but on this passage, have shown older scholarship was largely based on German anti-Semitic presuppositions that were so prevalent in 19th century and early 20th century scholarship that they basically went unexamined. And part of that involved the idea that Jesus was not really a Jew, or was nominally a Jew, but was establishing a, quote, better religion, a superior universal religion, as opposed to the narrow ethnic and legally based religion of Judaism in the universal version of Christianity. None of that is true. Not one word of that is true, and scholars have universally rejected what's obviously an anti-Semitic view of Jesus rejecting his own tradition and taking up a brand new one that he invented and to replace it. So it's simply nothing but anti-Semitic slurs, and we've seen the effect of that not only in the Holocaust, but even in recent times, where whether it's about the war in Israel with Gaza or simply the anti-Semitic hate crimes all around that many Christians still see their job to destroy Jews, or at least to ignore them, and to denigrate those who serve in the Jewish tradition, like priests. But we're going to look more closely at who priests really were and what was going on here in Luke's mind, perhaps, in having a priest and then a Levite going down that road. So before we do that, just note what happens, and it's parallel with the Levite. He's going down the road, and he saw him. And the seeing is clear, and as my note below says, it recalls the word to Simon the Pharisee about the woman who anointed Jesus' feet. Do you see this woman? And so in this situation, the priest does see the man who's beaten on the side of the road. He doesn't just not see him and ignore him, but he sees him and chooses to pass on the other side. And again, that's a rare word only here and the next verse in the New Testament, noting the exact parallel between them. So we have to pause to say, what do we know about priests in that world? And it's really important that if you were raised Catholic or in Episcopalian, where there are Christian priests, the role of priests to say the Catholic Mass and things that Catholic priests traditionally have done, especially if you're older, like running the whole community. Now that's mostly done by lay people, but depending upon your age and your experience, you may associate priests in this story with the priests you know. Let's try to put that aside, because other than the fact that the word is the same in English, their roles were very different. But one of the issues around priests was, how are you authorized? In the Catholic Church or in the Episcopal Church, of course, you're ordained by an official ritual that's sanctioned by the institution. But there really was not an institution in that sense. In Jerusalem, there's a leadership, the Sanhedrin, the Council of Jerusalem. But that's not really a religious leadership as such. That's the interface between the people of Jerusalem and the Romans for the sake of maintaining peace. And the high priest was a part of that council. And we certainly wouldn't say it wasn't religious in the sense it's based on the traditions that they understand that they're keeping over against the Romans often in the situation there, where the Romans demand things that folks in Jerusalem aren't willing to do. And historically, that led to the crucifixion of many people who were resisting, including under Pontius Pilate, who's the procurator in the time of our story. But in the absence of a formal ritual, the Hebrew Bible had various traditions that had clearly been argued about in the past when there was even less of an institution, especially in the time in between the monarchy and the time of Luke's Gospel, where for hundreds of years the folks in Jerusalem were under the sway of other empires, whether that was the Persians, the Greeks, or now the Romans. So we have to look back at Hebrew scripture tradition to see some of this. So let's go back to the top of this chart. So as my note suggests here, in the Hebrew Bible, there are several traditions purporting to provide lineages and rules for who is a priest or is a Levite. And so there are three primary ones. I won't read this. It'll be posted on the webpage like all the PDFs are, but it's just to highlight three examples. One tradition is from Aaron, as we see in Exodus 28. Then bring near to you your brother Aaron and his sons with him from among the Israelites to serve me as priests. And then they're named. So in that tradition, lineage from Aaron makes you a priest. But there's another tradition here in Deuteronomy. The Levitical priests, the whole tribe of Levi, shall have no allotment or inheritance within Israel. They may eat the sacrifices of the Lord's portion, which is to say they are allocated not land to be farmers or shepherds like the rest of the people, but to serve in the place where Yahweh's name will be put, which is named in the previous chapter in Deuteronomy 17 around the law of the king, and in chapter 16 in Deuteronomy around the various feasts celebrated in the city where Yahweh's name will be, which is obviously Jerusalem. So from this tradition, the tribe of Levi is designated as the priestly leadership that will, instead of having land, will be supported in food by the others, and serve the community and serve Yahweh in Jerusalem. And then there's a third tradition that comes out of the monarchy, coming out of the David tradition, when David had two priests, Abiathar and Zadok, and Abiathar ends up dead in the succession, and Zadok and his line continue. So we see in 1 Kings 4, which is a little after the time of David, into the time of Solomon, these were his, which would say Solomon's high officials, as Uriah, son of Zadok, was the priest. So we see three different lineages, and that's affirmed in 2 Chronicles. But to highlight the fact that this is ambiguous and controversial, in the exilic context of Ezekiel, we see hybrid cases. Note this from Ezekiel 40. The priests who have charge of the altar, these are the descendants of Zadok, who alone among the descendants of Levi may come nearer to the Lord to minister to him. But nothing previously had said that the descendants of Zadok were the same as the descendants of Levi. It certainly doesn't say that in the books of Samuel around the question of David. So Ezekiel is there trying to merge those together. And similarly, in a relatively late Exodus text like 38:21, we see the work of the Levites being under the direction of Ithamar, son of the priest Aaron. So in that situation, there are Levites, but they're now subservient to the priest under Aaron. And that's one of the elements by which some scholars see it in the time of Jesus. Priests had the authority and the Levites were like their liturgical assistants, much like perhaps lay staff might be, or perhaps deacons in relation to priests in the Catholic hierarchy. But some people thought that and others did not, and so it was controversial. One other tradition, only once in the Hebrew Bible, but it's in the letter to Hebrews, and so may have it in your mind, which is to be a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And the Melchizedek story comes out of Genesis 14, but the priesthood story is here from Psalm 110, as you see. Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. But we see nothing about that anything further. So out of these traditions, different traditions, we see that the question of who had priestly authority was controversial. And the given priest on the road going down from Jerusalem to Jericho in our story, we know nothing about, and Jesus doesn't specify. But it's to highlight that priests had a certain insecurity in their status, depending upon whether other priests or other people recognize them that way. And there were also many, many, many priests, and not all of them served. So, again, in the Catholic or Episcopal Church, most people who are not in retired age or priests are serving as priests, whether in a parish or a university or perhaps some other missionary function. But many of the priests in the Israelite tradition simply were priests, but were more or less on reserve until their time came up. And so there were way more priests because of lineage than people who were needed to do liturgical things, because after all there was only one temple. And note that it's hereditary, so there's no sense of it being a vocation, that Yahweh has called me or my children specifically to be priests the way we might imagine today, or older Catholic families, when they had large families, thought they'd give one son to God as a priest. Whether the son wanted to be or not is a separate question. But this is all by inheritance. So we can certainly imagine that many people were born in priestly families but didn't particularly want to do that, and may have brought disrepute because of their lack of interest or their lack of ability. There's also no specific sense that there's training, that they know the law, the Torah, and all the rules. And many scholars who are scholars and know all the rules often assume unconsciously that the priests in the Bible would know intimately all the Hebrew Bible rules and would have that in their heads. And maybe some would, but maybe some would not. And even throughout Catholic history, most of the priests were not particularly educated, were taken out of villages to serve their local people. And it's really not till the modern world that priesthood, like ordination in Protestant churches, became a professional status that you go get a master's degree in and then apply for a job like any other profession. So the notion we might have now of priests being knowledgeable and trained, and even today most don't know the Bible very well because it's simply not what they're required to do. They're not biblical scholars, they're leading communities or saying Mass and other sacraments. So whether now or then, we can't rightly assume that these priests were deeply knowledgeable in the Torah. And so his choosing to pass by on the other side may be, as some scholars suggest, a matter of balancing provisions that allow for caring for someone but don't require it, versus defiling your body by touching somebody like this after you're leaving the temple and can't be purified. That kind of arguing between passages is probably something more in the minds of modern scholars than was actually in the minds of someone passing by this man on the side of the road. But it could be, we simply don't know. So let's look at priests in Luke Acts and see whether we can learn something from the context here. And we saw it right in the first verses that a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah, which we know nothing about, it's only there. And curiously, his wife, Elizabeth, of course, was a descendant of Aaron. So she's from a priestly family. He's of the priestly order of Abijah, and yet he's not serving as priest here, although he will at one point. Then we hear in chapter 3 about the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. And the high priesthood is a very special thing. That's the designation that the Romans allow to be the person that they designate to be the representative, to work, to be the interface, so to speak, between the Jerusalem community and the Romans. And so when Jesus is put on trial and is crucified, we'll see the high priests are the ones who are involved. But a couple of times Jesus does things and tells people to go show yourself to the priest. We see it here with the leper here, with the leper down here, and we saw it here with the person that had been healed here as well. Go show yourself to the priest, singular here and plural here. And scholars debate whether that's meant to be a witness against the priest or to be following the law by showing yourself to the priest according to the rules for when you've been healed. That's ambiguous too. But we know that they're around in these places available for people, not just in Jerusalem, because obviously they're not in Jerusalem till we get to chapter 19 down here. We already saw in 6:4 the question of eating, and that had to do with the bread for the priest to eat, the bread of the presence in the story about David getting special bread when his troops were hungry. But that doesn't really tell us much about priesthood. And then we see the elements of the chief priests, scribes, and others conspiring to kill him. And we see that continuing in Acts when Peter and John speak up, and we see the same people who had turned Jesus over to the Romans trying to decide what to do with his disciples down here. And as I note below, all the other uses of priests in Acts refer to the high priest. So given that, there's one other element to look at, and this is, again, one of those fruits of the recent scholarship that I reviewed in the introductory video, and I won't go through and provide citations to all of these, but if you go back and look at that video, I posted a chart of all the various articles beyond Chalmers that we'll look at in just a minute. So one of those noted that the phrase priests, Levites, and the people, or some version of that, was a shorthand in some late Hebrew biblical texts for the entire people. And here are some examples from 2 Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And Ezra and Nehemiah is really important because that's one of the pairs of texts, Ezra and Nehemiah really being one book divided into two, that separated out the Samaritans from the process of rebuilding the Jerusalem temple and ostensibly provides some of the ground for the hostility that scholars have often assumed between Samaritans and Judeans in Jerusalem. But before we get to that question, let's just look at this phrase. So without worrying about the context, let's just note the phrase that's being presented here. Do not let anyone enter the house of Yahweh except the priest and ministering Levites. They may enter, for they are holy, but all the other people shall observe the instructions of Yahweh. So notice that all the other people are separate from priests and Levites, but that includes everybody. And we see the same kind of thing here. 10 chapters later, the king went up to the house of Yahweh with all the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the Levites, all the people, both great and small. And we see the same thing here with the people of Israel first, then priests and Levites, and all the people with the priests and Levites and Nehemiah and Ezra. So that combination in these late texts, in these post-exilic texts, seems to imply that priests, Levites, and the people express the fullness of all Israel. So one of the questions that people like Chalmers are looking at here is whether when we see a priest go by and a Levite go by, people would expect an ordinary person to go by, and what comes is a Samaritan. And that precisely the question is the Samaritan to be seen as some kind of hated other or as simply another of the people? Before we get to that, let's look at verse 32 just for a minute and note a couple interesting things here that will help us farther ahead. My note below suggests several factors suggest the Levite knew the priest was ahead on the road. The contour of the road itself makes visibility and distance easy, but that may or may not be the case. As I showed in the picture last time of the current road where you can see curves and you can't always see around the bend. Keeping track of travelers was a common security measure, which is to say, just like people walking the street of a city late at night, you'd note behind the corners and see if somebody was there. and exchanges with travelers passing the other way who would normally include inquiries about who was on the road, like, is it safe to be going down this passage in the part of the road? And so, as Bailey notes from decades ago, that may well be the case, but we don't know how long it is between the priest and the Levite. It simply says when he came to the place. So we have no specific reason to think that the priest was there 1 second and the Levite was there another second. It could be much later, and intervening could have been many other people. We don't know in Jesus' story. It's worth pausing on the word likewise for a second. Homoios here. It's 30 times in the New Testament, so it's not one of the rare words. But what's key is it's here in 1032. It'll recur in 1037 when Jesus will turn it on the lawyer. So just as the priest and the Levite are likewise, the question will be, will the lawyer be likewise with the Samaritan? But we'll get to that in the next video. So likewise, a Levite here, and Levites are in Luke's gospel are only here and only one time in Acts, and then in John 1:19, which is worth looking at for 1 second, so it underscores just the point I was making about priests and Levites here. So we see this is the testimony given by John the Baptist, when the Judeans sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who are you? And they had to give an answer to those who sent them, as we see down here. So priests and Levites, again, associated in John's gospel, but that's the only other place we see Levites mentioned anywhere in the New Testament. So when he came to the place, and we don't know what the place is, it's simply a place on the road, and saw, and he sees also, identically, he passes by on the other side. But we get to the Samaritan. So as we get to the Samaritan, a couple of things. We saw a Samaritan village in chapter 9 at the very beginning of the travel narrative in 952, refused to give hospitality to Jesus' disciples because Jesus' face was set for Jerusalem. And that led many scholars to think, you see what I mean? We mean the Samaritans hate the Judeans. But that's not necessarily a matter of hate, and it doesn't necessarily apply to all Samaritans. One of the beautiful things about how Luke portrays things, and Luke Timothy Johnson, a great Luke scholar, highlighted this a number of years ago around the question of wealth, is that Luke's Jesus doesn't have one answer that fits all. For example, on the question of wealth, he says at one point, if you want to be my disciples, you must say goodbye to all your possessions. And in the Sermon on the Plain, we heard him say, woe to the rich, you've already received your reward. And yet he also says to wealthy people, when you hold a banquet or a wedding feast, don't just invite your rich friends and neighbors, but invite the poor. And it assumes that people have houses and enough wealth to have a wedding feast or a great banquet. So there's not one size fits all. There's a matter of discerning what's fitting for the given person, which is not to give wealthy people a pass, but to highlight that if they have wealth, they either need to give it away or use it for the benefit of others. So in a similar way, we can't assume that just because one Samaritan village rejected Jesus, all the Samaritans hate all the Judeans, any more than we could say in our cultural context that just because some people are racist in one way or another, or are full of hate against one group, that everybody in the category that the hater is in hates the people who that person hates. It's obviously not the case, and each person or each group needs to be evaluated separately. So plainly, some Samaritans were willing to reject people who were on their way to Jerusalem, because one of the key differences between Samaritans and Judeans were where they were to worship. And obviously, the Judeans were worshiping in Jerusalem, and the Samaritans were worshiping on Mount Gerizim. When I was first working on John's Gospel, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I relied heavily on the passage in 2 Kings 17, 24-41, which highlights that the Samaritans were really a hybrid people based on the previous Israelites and people that the Assyrians had brought in to intermingle with them to dilute their sense of nationality. And I took that as factual and highlighted that sense that the 5 nations that the Babylonians, or including the Babylonians that they had brought in, the Assyrians had brought in, represented the 5 husbands, the 5 men in John 4. And that may well still be the case. But the question is whether you can take that as fact. And as Chalmers and others have noted, the Deuteronomistic history, and especially the books of Kings, are a very Jerusalem-centered story. And they present the, quote, sin of Jeroboam, who was the king in the northern kingdom of Israel, after it was divided, after Solomon's son Rehoboam couldn't hold it together, as always a sin held by other kings, simply for the fact of having a monarchy that wasn't centered in Jerusalem. So we know how deeply Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem is the only answer for those people. Much like for the Vatican, often Protestants who believe everything that Catholics might believe about Jesus and discipleship, but don't worship in a Catholic church under the quote-unquote proper sacrament ordained by an ordained priest. And so there are certainly those who believe that, but that doesn't mean everybody believes that, any more than ordinary Catholics on the ground might not feel perfectly comfortable going to their friends' Protestant churches from time to time for a wedding or for whatever. So just because officials with an ideology believe something doesn't mean everybody on the ground believes it. And that's another point that we need to make here, is that whether it's modern scholars or ancient writers like the authors of 1st and 2nd Kings, or people like Josephus, the Jewish historian, from whom we also have gotten information about Samaritans, it's pretty anti-Samaritan, we need to recognize that that's not necessarily the case on the ground. So without diving into the entire history that Chalmers engages in detail, and that his review of scholarship engages in even more detail, this 38-page article has 16 pages of bibliography just since 2004. So in the 17 years that he's reviewing here, there's 16 pages of articles, and I'm not going to lay all that on you. But the bottom line that he and others reach here is that the Samaritans are simply Israelites. Under another name, the very name Samaritan is one put on them because their capital city was Samaria, both in the time of Israel as a monarchy, but also in the time of Jesus. And that they are as much Israelites as anybody else. And they worship Yahweh, and they're not at all ethnically outside, or are they hated necessarily, except perhaps by some of the elite. The one question of an exception is in Luke 17:16, where there are the 10 lepers, and the one leper who gives thanks to Jesus is described as a Samaritan, and Jesus calls him what's translated here as a foreigner, allogenes. But as Chalmers notes, that doesn't necessarily imply somebody who's hated. That can simply mean an expression of difference. That doesn't necessarily mean a hated expression of difference. So even though Jesus characterized him as a foreigner there, allogenes, literally someone of a different race, that doesn't mean that it's negative necessarily, or that that Jesus is seeing him as someone who's not worthy of Yahweh. And in fact, the fact that he gives thanks, just like what he does here, makes him very worthy. So let's just finish our verse before we stop this long video for today. While traveling, came near, and when he saw him, and this is a terrible translation, he was moved with compassion. Literally, it's a word meaning your guts were churned, and pity is a terrible translation of that. It's otherwise compassion. Let's look at briefly at two other examples of that so we can see where else people are moved with compassion. In 7:13, Jesus is, for the widow of Nain here, moved with compassion for her and raises her child from the dead. And in 15:20, we see the father in the prodigal son story, who's certainly a representation of God and what is explicitly a parable there, moved with compassion when he sees his son. So in other words, the people filled with compassion are Jesus and God and a Samaritan. So we'll stop there for now, and next time we'll see what that compassion for a neighbor looks like and how Jesus is using this as an example for the lawyer. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.